¿Podemos empezar? No, bien, ya. Está la cara de Autores. Bueno, muchas gracias por venir al seminario. Tenemos hoy un invitado internacional. Dominic Rohner es profesor de la Universidad de Lausanne. También trabaja actualmente en Ginebra, en el Geneva Graduate Institute. Trabaja sobre temas justamente de conflictos, factores económicos, cómo pueden impactar en la solución de conflictos, ¿no? Y obviamente está acabando de la economía y las ciencias políticas y la geopolítica global. Y bueno, en el contexto actual creemos que este paper es súper interesante y la conferencia que va a dar esta tarde también es más abierto a todo el público, así que obviamente están más que invitados a venir. Ahora le voy a dejar a Dominic que nos presente su trabajo. Obviamente, como siempre, si podemos volver a la pregunta al final, y si no, vamos cortando. Ya le advertí que nuestra mecánica de seminario podemos interrumpir y hacer las preguntas a medida que va presentando. Y al final, aquellos que estén interesados, nos quedamos un ratito, si les parece, y hablamos con Dominic y con Nicolás de Petri, que también es un profe de esta casa, que hoy en día está, ya hace unos años está en Ginebra también trabajando en una escuela de allá como profesor e investigador, y que sería interesante quizás nos cuente a becarios, a doctorandos, a profesores, investigadores de IEP, cómo es un poco el sistema universitario y de investigación en Suiza, qué posibilidades de cooperación hay con la Universidad de Buenos Aires, con nosotros, temas de financiamientos o becas, o bueno, alguna manera de que podamos continuar este lazo que quizás arranca hoy con esta conferencia, y que obviamente ya con Nicolás bilateralmente ya tenemos mucho tiempo, pero que estaría bueno por ahí que todo el día también pueda aprovechar. Así que bueno, sin más, Dominic, the floor is yours. Ready?
Okay, thanks a lot for coming. Well, the talk will be in English because my Spanish is not good enough to speak in Spanish, but I mean, if you have a question in Spanish, I can try to understand and answer in English. So again, thanks a lot for organizing this and for coming. It's really fantastic. Thanks to all of you. So first, this is just an academic paper, and then at 6 o'clock I'll talk about the book, the peace formula. That's like a more general thing. So this is called Does Money Win Wars? Joint work with Jonathan Federle and Moritz Schularick, and it's kind of it asks the very general question of what's, you know, are wars won by money, or is it something else that determines who wins wars? And the topic is sadly very timely at the moment, because you have the war in Iran, you have the war in Ukraine, and so what will determine what will happen in these wars and in other wars? And if you look back in history, I mean, the Romans, for example, if you look at the story of Rome, so there's on Audible, for example, there's a wonderful podcast, The History of Rome, and it's like 100, a lot of episodes, like 150 episodes, and every emperor is another episode. It's very fascinating stuff. My wife was saying, "Well, you're crazy. You're the only person on earth who finished the whole podcast with 150 episodes. You're completely nuts." But if you look at that, what you see is that Romans often they would hit a wall, and they would fight against somebody kind of who would outsmart them, Hannibal or something. You know, Hannibal would kind of come over the Alps with the elephants and would win against the Romans, or then they meet some other general who's really strong. But in the long run, Rome always wins. And the reason that Rome always won for 1,000 years is that they had deeper pockets, right? They just had the logistics. They had Egypt as the grain chamber, and then with all the cash from Egypt, they would be able to keep the whole thing running. So they lose once, their whole fleet gets destroyed. They're not really great sailors. They're much better at army than at navy. And then they just have the cash to reconstruct another fleet, and then they start again. And at some point they win. And so that's kind of the anecdote that kind of inspired that. And then, partly listening to this podcast and stuff. And then Another anecdote, if you think of World War II, right? You had World War II, you had Hitler, Blitzkrieg, who would kind of attack all Europe. At some point, Hitler would control, the Nazis would control all of Europe, or pretty much, besides Britain. And then, well, there were two big mistakes, thankfully. Thankfully, they made this mistake. First mistake, they tried the same thing as Napoleon to kind of attack Russia when it was cold. So not a smart move. And then their allies, the Japanese, they did the mistake of attacking Pearl Harbor. And then when the Americans entered the war, well, that was kind of turning the tide, right? Because they were the ones with the deep pockets. And so, again, in the long run, in the short run, great powers would lose, maybe, but in the long run, at some point, money would matter. And that was also the case for World War II. But of course, we as economists, we are a bit unsatisfied with these historical accounts because these are correlations. They're not causal, everything is endogenous, it's a mess. And what we like to do is to quantify things and to do statistics. And so this paper is about that. It's basically, well, there is this anecdotal evidence of some historical case studies, but we want to measure things and we want to have some econometric evidence. And so that's what the paper is all about, and we're going to say something about channels, etc. Is this clear so far?
Yes.
Okay. So what we do specifically, so we have a bit more than 700 militarized interstate disputes. So they're not all of them full-blown wars. So you have the wars like Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. All these wars would be there, but and you also have smaller conflicts. You have things that where maybe 20 people die and a border conflict, but not a full-blown war that you read in the news. And so we would exploit exogenous price changes of about 300 products during conflict. So imagine that there's a war between Switzerland and Argentina, right? If the price of Malbec and dulce di leche goes up, then that's a very positive shock for Argentina. While if the price of Swiss cheese goes up, then it's a really good shock for Switzerland. And it's these kind of things that we exploit. And we exploit this as world market price shocks. So things that are not caused by Argentina or Switzerland, and we focus on countries that are price takers, that don't have market power to be price makers. Otherwise, the whole thing is endogenous. And so, what do we find? We find that a 10 percentage point windfall gain relative to GDP would increase the chances of winning instead of ending up in a draw by 4 percentage points. And so we're going to give a clear quantification, and so that's the quantitative result. And in terms of mechanisms, what we're going to find is that what's going on is that the export revenues will go up. A big part of it gets into the pockets of the government, and then that will augment military expenditures and also investment in military capacity. So we're going to show a few things on military spending, but also on kind of, do they buy tanks and this kind of stuff. So that's kind of on the menu. So let me start with some other anecdotes. An anecdote that is in our data set. The Roman Empire is not in our data set. So here we have Libya, Gaddafi's Libya that was kind of aggressive and attacking neighbors and stuff. And so there was basically the war between Libya and Chad. And what happened is that they had some border dispute, and Libya would kind of support some anti-government separatist rebellion. And you had, and so they had two wars. The first Chad-Libyan war and the second Chad-Libyan war. And in the first one, Libya won. And that was the time when they were doing really well in terms of oil revenue. I mean, Libya is like a major gas and oil producer. And so So basically what happened is that in that time, that was the time of the Iranian Revolution, that was the end of the unprecedented export boom of Europe, where les Trente Glorieuses in French, where basically all Europe was booming, and a lot of other countries around the world after World War II, everything was reconstructed, and that stopped in 1973. These were the oil shocks that would kind of plunge the whole world economy. But for oil exporters, it was of course good news, because the oil price was really, really high at that point. And so with really high oil prices, the Libyan regime would be super well equipped and would easily win this first war. And then in the revenge war, the second war, times were very different, because then basically OPEC was struggling, the oil price dumped, and we have plenty of anecdotes that Libya tried to buy desperately Soviet arms, but the Soviet Union wouldn't sell them arms because they said, we only sell against cash, you don't have cash, you don't get our arms, and then they lost. And that was kind of entered history as the Toyota War, because they took Toyota pickups for tourists and mounted some machine gun on the pickups, and would kind of be very agile and win this war with this very unusual strategy. And so that is one example where with a lot of cash export booms you win, and with export dump you lose. So the question is that an exception? You have plenty of other examples: Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, plenty of things. But again, as I was saying, we care about doing some econometric analysis. Yes.
Sorry. As Priscilla said, we are not patient people, so I have two questions. First is, you can think of the same mechanism going through the import channel. For instance, if you are an oil importer, you have a negative shock if the prices go up. Have you explored that? And the second one is, it is always straight to say, well, this country won and the other country lost, because perhaps some things, nothing happens and the conflict is stalled, and I don't know. Who's winning the Russia-Ukraine war? I don't know. That's my second.
Well, I mean, so the Russia-Ukraine war is not over yet.
Not yet.
Of course, at least in Europe, we have very clear views who we want to win the war. But yeah, so the first question, I mean, as you will see, I'll get there. I think in the next. One of the next slides, in 2 or 3 slides I get there, is basically what we do is we take relative net exports, so exports minus imports, so we take this into account. And the other question on measuring who wins wars, that's indeed not easy, and we just free ride on political scientists. So it's the usual strategy where political scientists have put together wonderful data that is much better than what we economists would be able to do. We take their data and we do the statistics in a way that is econ style and a bit differently than what they do. So in some sense, it's a bit of free riding on the data. So the good thing about it is, of course, that nobody can accuse us of kind of making up the numbers, because we take it off the shelf. And their coding they will have they will code actual victories where it's clear cut who won, you know. But then there are also cases that are more like concessions. So it's like something, at the end of the day, it's not that one won, but one would give payments to the other, or something like whatever, US, Venezuela, for example. And then we do robustness checks depending on whether we look at only straight victories, or we also look at victories in the sense of receiving concessions from the others. Our main treatment is all encompassing. It is with also concessions, but the results go through even stronger if we just focus on straight victories. Yeah. So, but please ask questions and interrupt, because you know, in our already now when I kind of showed James Bond movies to my kids, right? And you know my kids. the thing is that they find that boring now, right? At the moment, if a generation finds James Bond movies boring, I mean, you can find them, politically bad or biased or misogynist, or you can qualify it of many things, but boring is kind of weird, right? So I understand that the attention span goes down. Even when we teach, we kind of need an anecdote every few minutes to keep people, hooked. So yeah, please do ask questions. So in terms of the existing literature, there is work on commodity price shocks and conflict, but on civil wars. So I have a paper, for example, called This Mine is Mine, where we look at mineral price shocks and conflict. So we have these kind of things, but that's very different. I mean, civil wars and interstate wars are very different. And one thing that's really great about our interstate war data is that it's the only data where we have data on who wins and who loses. For civil wars, this data doesn't exist. And again, making it up ourselves, the data is kind of, would be dangerous because of confirmation bias. So that's, and then there is this literature looking at economic power and interstate wars. So there are great work by political scientists, but very often the variables they use are endogenous variables, like military spending, which is an endogenous choice variable. And it's more like correlations than causality, and what we bring to that is more analysis of causality and of mechanisms. Okay, so what is the data that we use? So in terms of the data, we have trade data from Comtrade and from the Harlas Atlas of Economic Complexity. Then we have various macroeconomic variables on military expenditure, GDP, debt, inflation from IMF, government revenues from World Bank and IMF, population data from Madison Project, and then the conflict data, the militarized interstate disputes data is from correlates of war. So that's a big data resource from political science. If you're interested in these topics of wars, afterwards when we talk about mobility and Swiss universities and stuff, I can also say a few things about some policy projects where I'm the research director. One is called Recipe. This Recipe project, we hand out grants for studying conflict, and there I can also tell you about what kind of data is around and what kind of policy initiatives are around. So afterwards, if you want, I can say more on this data. But this data here is just is a traditionally available data on interstate wars, and it's just whether two countries are in a war and who wins. So either there's a winner, and then there are also cases where there's a draw, where they code it as a draw, where it's not clear who won. So that's just one example where kind of the US pressure would make Iraq making concessions, and so there, in that case, US would be coded as the winner. And so here you have all the conflicts. So the full-blown wars, intensity 5, that's the highest intensity. These are really the big wars, Iran, Iraq, thousands of people die. And then, of course, the Ukraine war, or also now Iran, US would also be big wars, right? Then you have use of force, where less than 1,000 people die, but people die and it's violent. And then you have display of force, where you do violent stuff, you block things, etc. But it's less lethal. And then you have also a lower category. The results, we show them for all the categories, but we do the robustness checks where we only focus on the top highest intensity levels. And the results are, as expected, stronger if we only look at the...
Just out of curiosity, isn't the Malvinas UK war included in your sample?
Yes.
Who won?
That's not difficult.
I was hoping to avoid this subject. No, but yeah, no, that's included.
We are in 1980.
Yeah, that's. But I think the intensity level, whether it's 4 or 5, I'm not sure, because the death total was around, I think it was more than 1,000, no?
Around 1,000.
Exactly, it was like,
Putting, yes,
I think it's probably category 5, but
adding
maybe
up
it's for...
Britain, British and Argentina,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
yes, yes. 1,000 maybe.
Yeah.
It was pretty
Yeah,
high.
no, but it's in the data.
It's in the data.
Yeah. And so here, so our data stops here just because at some point the political scientists were fed up with coding this stuff. And so yeah, that's when the data, available data stops. And of course there are fewer decisive wars because the ones at those years, they were still ongoing when they stopped coding. So yeah, I mean, they didn't know who won for an ongoing war. It's like if today we collect data on Ukraine war, we don't know yet who will win. Yeah, so that's our data on conflict. So what's the regression that we run? So we have basically T dyadic conflicts with one conflict being labeled small d between 1 and d. Conflict starts in a year TD with a duration of LD of years. A pair of opponent countries is OD with the two countries A and B. And then we have trade-specific variables where C is the set of different commodities, these 300 commodities, like chocolate or dulce con leche or Malbec or cheese and stuff. Of course also oil and lithium and these commodities. Trade at the price PCT, that's a world price, so it doesn't vary at the diet level, but only at the level of commodity C and the year T. And XACT denotes the opponent A's value of net exports of commodity C in a year T. And so basically our variable of interest is delta VD, and that's basically the appreciation of A's pre-conflict net exports due to price changes during the conflict, D. So that means I take my pre-conflict net exports and I would the PDF is a bit weird. So I think the formula is a bit, yeah, it's not a big deal. It should look a bit differently, but yeah, so you have the pre-conflict net exports, and you interacted with the returns of the price change of the commodity. And why do we take the pre-conflict ones? Because that's exogenous, right? Because if during the conflict now the wine production stops, then you don't want to do that. You want to have the pre-conflict level of production with the world price shock, so that everything is exogenous. But we also do we can also do it with current production, and the results go through. Yes.
Are you adjusting both export and import prices, or?
Yes. So yeah.
Because you're measuring net exports, or?
Exactly. Yeah. It's net exports exactly of all commodities over all years during which the conflict took place. And so that's at the country level. We sum everything up. Yeah.
No, I was just wondering. For instance, the Argentina-England war about the Falklands lasted only for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering what happens if you use monthly prices, because it may be misleading to use the average annual price, because the shock would have happened after the war ended. For instance, in August, I don't know, the war ended in June.
Yeah. So what we do is we have robustness checks where we weight the results by the length of the war. Okay. Where we basically take into account that some wars are much shorter than others. But it's true that I mean our prices are annual prices. We could think about maybe doing it with monthly prices and stuff. It's a good idea, yeah. But yeah, so far, I mean, what we could also try to do is maybe robustness checks where we have a minimal and a maximal duration, where we only focus on wars that have at least this length and maximum that length, or something. Yeah. I know it's an exciting topic.
Wars are exciting.
No, so, and then what we do is, of course, we take the, well, it's all relative, right? It's for a given diet. So if Nico and I are the diet, then it's the relative difference between his delta and my delta. And that's the variable WD. And yeah, and so with that variable we work. And then we well, basically, that's so then we have different samples where either we have all disputes or then we only have large disputes where we exclude only large disputes. So we do robustness checks where we have all kinds of, yeah, we can have bigger or smaller samples and we find very similar results. Yeah, so then, so here you have some stylized facts on the delta of military spending, pre-shock GDP. You see that well, this varies quite a bit, and then you have basically the windfalls in a case where you're the winner or in a case where you're in a draw, and you see that on average, indeed, it correlates. So you have much higher windfalls in the case where you're a winner. You're much, yeah. Yeah. And so now let's run the regressions. Okay.
One question. You are measuring the change in wealth of the country with the changes in net stores.
Yeah.
I wonder if you don't have to measure the level of wealth.
The level of
the GDP, for example.
Yeah.
It's another question, but I wonder if.
Yeah. No. I mean, I could. So the political scientists have done that already. So they have looked at the levels of things like GDP, but that's of course endogenous, right? In some sense, right? And, I mean, Hitler increased. I mean, he used kind of the multiplier, Keynesian multiplier by constructing, highways that would go, would be really convenient for the tanks and would go straight to the Polish border. So it's clear that if we were to just use purely GDP, well then it's less exogenous than using these shocks. But we have. We can do some. So we'll show you some two SLS IB regressions where we use the shock to instrument for public spending, and so we will see that goes maybe in the direction of what you're saying, but we could, yeah, I mean we could look at the general GDP or wealth level as well, but yeah, it's just less clean in terms of identification strategy, but maybe it's. But it would be useful to at least do some correlations, I think. Yeah. So here it should be a bit different.
Do you have your pen right?
I have mine. Shall we try, or does it? I don't know if it changes something. I mean, otherwise it's not such a big deal, but I think. So let's quickly try with. I have taken over the PowerPoint with me. PowerPoint was too big to say. So for either one, I think we should be fine.
Yeah, I changed it to PowerPoint. It's PDF. Maybe one. Yes, that's the idea. No tenemos para más que. Sí, pero no más allá. Yeah, of course.
so basically now you have the correct formulas, right? Now it's better. So, but it didn't change much. But basically, yeah, I think it had a problem with the brackets, right?
Yes.
Now it's okay. Yeah. So basically, the regression we run is the following: on the left-hand side, QPT. And QPT takes a value of 1 if the opponent won, 0 if the war ended in a draw, -1 if the opponent A lost. And then we have our variable of the relative net export shock between the two. And then we have some fixed effects at the country pair level, at the year level. And some controls and some error term. And so if we look at the main results, so first, if we don't control for anything, we just run the regression, what we find is a coefficient of 0.35. So what this means is that if you have a 1% increase in windfalls, then that leads to 0.3% changes in winning chances. So meaning that a 10% increase in incomes in windfalls would lead to a 3% increase in winning chances with respect to having a draw. And then we can control for a set of controls. We can control for diet fixed effects, and then we can also add year fixed effects. And in that case, you see that the coefficient is quite stable for these. In all these cases, we find similar quantitative results. And then, well, now first of all, let's think about the elephant in the room. So the main confounder could, of course, be that the prices are endogenous, right? And that's, I mean, I wrote a few op-eds where I kind of explained to people that well, I argue that in Europe we should be less dependent on fossil fuels, because at the end of the day, who pays Putin's war in Ukraine? Well, it's peaceful Swiss car drivers, right? Because the fuel price goes up, and the money of the higher fuel price goes directly into the coffins of the Kremlin. And so at the end of the day, Putin gets his war for free. So what he spends on the army is exactly what he gets into through higher energy prices. And so yeah, that's, well, maybe Swiss car or Argentinian car drivers want to do something else than pay for that, right? Well, so that could be a problem, right? That if, especially for big producers, so if Iran starts a war, or Iraq, or Russia, they are so big oil producers that this will affect the oil price. Or if if Argentina has a monopoly on dulce di leche, I mean, then the dulce di leche price would kind of change a lot if Argentina attacks Uruguay or something, right? But yeah,
quantities may well go down, right?
Yeah. So you're right. So in principle, it should kind of bias the results against us. It should be an attenuation bias.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, we were not counting on the referees agreeing with this argument, and so we wanted to show it also in the data. And so in the data, what we do is we run exactly the same regressions as before, but we remove the commodities for a diet where the joint global export share is bigger than something. So you would remove oil when it's about Iran and Iraq, because together their market share is more than whatever percentage. And what you see is exactly what you said, is that in principle, again, as it worked against us, if we remove this potential bias, the results are stronger. And that's what you see here. And you see whenever you restrict the net export share to smaller than 10%, 5%, or 1%, in all these cases, so it's not driven by price makers, and it goes through when we focus on price takers. And then so that was the first thing. Then we do some placebo tests. where we kind of just randomly allocate windfalls or start years of conflicts. And then we do plenty of robustness checks. Well, I'm maybe not going to go through, if you're very keen, I can show them, or I can go through, and then we have more time for questions.
I think
Yeah.
no.
So, no, I was just wondering, perhaps there are not too many cases, but let's imagine that the Panama Canal is closed. So Panama is not a major producer of anything, but if the canal is closed, a lot of commodities won't be able to go through the world. And I wonder if you have a chance of identifying cases in which the opponents are not the main producers or exporters of a commodity, but perhaps they control a territory where those commodities may need to travel, or I don't know, some railroad facilities which are strategic, or ports, I don't know. Perhaps it's not easy to identify those cases, but they may have the same effect that.
So that's so we haven't done that. It's not easy, I think,
No.
but we could think about that. It's a good idea. I mean, in another paper, in a paper that we published a few years ago, we created some kind of heat map with straits and canals and stuff, where we kind of calculated purely based on geography which places are bottlenecks.
Okay.
And so we created this data of, and then we looked at whether at these bottlenecks there is more conflict or there is less conflict, and whether there is more conflict in times of globalization or less conflict. So in principle we have data that is, so we could in principle take from the other paper that data as a control variable interacted with something, so we should think.
Professor. Yes, the dependent variable just measures the net windfall revenue of any pair of what you call dyad countries, all right?
Yes.
But it's not net of any other expenditure in terms of GDP that would come about or occur during the war. Is that right or not?
Yes, you're right.
Because if you go to war, well, it was one of your motivation statements at the beginning when you started out your presentation. So what if you control for those expenditures? So you go to war, there is a net windfall revenue, but on the other hand, there are increasing military expenditures, health expenditures, and other expenditures, so like a second or third round effects. Have you tried to measure that, or is it on another agenda, let's say?
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's very relevant, but it's less exogenous, right? It's kind
Yes,
of,
I know.
So the problem is that if you know, whether you, I mean, if you have two countries here in war, right? So for the example, so you attack these guys here. So then, if here you have, you know, a very skillful leader, a great president, really good at managing the economy, really good at attacking the other country, listening to the generals, kind of skilled and evidence-based. Well, in this country, they will be able to have a higher fundraising capacity, more state capacity. They can levy more funds, but they also pursue better military strategies. And then here, the general is really bad, corrupt, and kind of doesn't listen to generals, and kind of only listens to himself, and doesn't kind of do the right economic and the right fiscal and the right military decisions. And so they will be able to levy fewer funds for the military campaign. So the problem is that if we add a variable of military spending, that this may pick up something else, right? This may pick up the skill of the...
Or human losses. Just
Yeah.
think of your human losses during the war and the length of these war periods.
So we have...
I know it is endogenous, I agree
Yeah.
with with you at that point. However,
So I have a few slides that you will like.
Okay.
I have a few slides where
Sure,
basically we look at state capacity. We
All
look
right.
at whether results are different for high or low state capacity.
think about Napoleon.
Yeah,
Napoleon
yeah.
going on war with Russia,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So that is one of the possible cases.
Yeah, no. So I mean, so our paper will be for policymakers. If you're whatever the German Chancellor Moritz, and you have to decide, do I give more military help to Ukraine or not? So what our paper will tell to the German Chancellor is, well, what you see is that this amount of exogenous change in money available for Ukraine will have this impact on its winning chance. Now, of course, if there are various ways in which Ukraine can levy funds. They can do inflation tax. They can get money from European allies. They can borrow. They can create debt. They can. So it is true that. So it's. Yeah. So I think that the ambition of the paper is kind of intermediate, right? It's not saying necessarily that this. I mean, the R square, like what we explain in a given conflict. There are many other factors, but what's good about our factor is that it's exogenous. It's a way of, because for the policymakers, that's probably the number that the policymaker wants to know. He wants to know, if I give $1 more billion to Ukraine, in how much of a change in the winning chances against Russia will it result, and also if Donald Trump decides to stop sanctioning the Russian fossil fuel exports because now it's not very convenient with the Iran war, what will the impact be on Russia winning? A spoiler alert, well, it helps a lot. The fact that the US attacked Iran is I mean, I'm sure that Putin was opening a bottle of champagne. It's the best thing that could happen to them, right? For 500 reasons. And so it's in this sense, but well, after the results with state capacity, please let me know if you like them or not.
Sure, yes.
So
Thank you.
So I have one question, because you rely on the exogeneity of commodity prices, but you can anticipate commodity prices. I mean, suppose you are in an era where commodities are going up, you believe they are still continuing to increase, and therefore, because you anticipate that, you say, well, I'm going to go to war now, that things are going to be okay for some periods, right?
Sure.
But and there are the commodity prices are not they are not random. They have a lot of autoregressive behavior.
Yeah. So I mean, we have in the newest version of the paper that's on my website, we have now added recently a robustness check on exactly that. What we do is we control for who has started the war, and we see that this doesn't affect the winning chances. And I mean, then whether, because in principle in that story, and when I presented it at the last conference, the comment I got was exactly in line with what you're saying, right? So it's a very relevant point of saying, well, but could then people not anticipate, and then maybe the stronger country would attack? But when we control for that, we see that it doesn't change our results. Our results go through when we control for who attacked.
But you can add also previous behavior of prices, right? So what happened last year?
So we could look at past prices as well. I mean, in principle, well, there are different views on that. One view could be that it's like a random walk, right? That it's kind of the price today already reflects all the expectation about future prices, and mechanically the likelihood that it goes up or down is kind of the same. But then, given that it's commodity prices and not currencies, then it's a bit more complex because, as you say, for commodity prices, well, there could be some trends or something. But yeah, we can look at past prices. It's a good idea.
Sorry, but you mentioned one thing that I wonder if you have included. I don't know if there is any data available for conflicts. International cooperation.
Yeah.
If Ukraine receives funding from the UA, so it helps beyond what happens with commodity prices. Are there statistics about that? I wonder. I imagine that it's difficult. If an ally provides you with planes, I don't know, tanks, ships, money, that would is a kind of windfall.
Yeah, no. I mean, so there are data on alliances, who's allied with whom, etc. And I think it would be interesting to study that. But here in this paper, what we do is we have this diet fixed effect, and the diet fixed effect would filter out many things. So the fact that the U.S. is if the U.S. attacks somebody, well, they're always the favorite, right? The other one is always the underdog because the U.S. is like the #1 superpower and stuff. But that's already in our diet fixed effect. So that's what we control for by that's not time varying. And then that Poland is a NATO member and that Russia is not a NATO member is also something that is in the diet fixed effects. Now we could, if we were to find the data on military aid, I think that would be interesting as well. Now I think it's probably a separate paper, right? It's more like one idea because here we're not claiming that commodity price shocks are the only determinants of conflict. We just claim that by having the time fixed effect and the diet fixed effect, we get rid of many of confounders and that our commodity price shocks is orthogonal to other variables going on. But it's clear that if our exercise was different, then maybe we could do something where we would try to do some gross accounting or something where we would say, okay, well there are 10 factors, and what is the importance of each of the factors? But yeah, here what we do is we wanted to have something where we can isolate an exogenous shock in money. But then what you're saying is one could do, for example, if I had the data on military spending, then I could look at some flypaper effect. I could look at, does the money that comes from a commodity price shock has a different impact than money earmarked coming from an ally? And does it have a different effect from increasing my debt? Or so yeah, these things are not necessarily fungible. They're different sources of financing, and the effects may be different. So it would be relevant to study. So we have some effects on robustness checks on including or excluding wars with large coalitions, ordered bloodshed, different coding of decisive outcomes versus kind of concessions, conflicts with bigger level of intensity, weighting or not weighting by duration of conflict, controlling for outliers, for conflicts, diets, countries, product groups. So I can go back to that, but in the interest of time, maybe. So how much longer do I have?
We have maximum half an hour for all discussion, and we can start the discussion, but maybe they.
Okay. So
we can finish, and then we can.
Don't you not control for the war configuration?
Thanks for coming. No, I mean we can do that. I could look at. I mean we weight the results by the duration of conflict. So that's something we do. But we could also do take the duration into account in other ways, like either control for the duration of a given conflict, or what we could do is we could trim the sample and take out things that wars that last too long or too short, or so there are things we can do actually. So let me show you some further results. So So now we are like in the realm of mechanisms already. So here we have basically, we can create a variable of government revenue, the delta of revenues, not commodity prices, but of revenues, which goes a bit in the direction of some of the comments received, where we have the revenues of basically now versus before the war with respect to GDP. And in the first stage, we look at how windfalls affect government revenues, and in the second stage, we look at how instrumented revenues affect winning chances. When we do that, what we find in the first stage is that roughly, basically, a third of windfalls go into government revenues. So in some, through taxes, for example. So if there is some excess profit of the Argentinian oil company, well, a third will go to will be taxed and goes into taxes in general, right? Then basically in the second stage, the revenues, these instrumented revenues, their impact on conflict is at the order of elasticity of 1, meaning that you have, if you have a 10% increase in revenues, state revenues, that would lead to a 10% increase in chances of winning with respect to a draw. So that's when we look at this channel in some sense. And then what we can do is we can look at, well, how does the exclusion restriction play a role here? Is it basically, because in order for windfalls to work through revenues, so that's what we supposed in the last slide, that it goes through government revenues, in order to kind of be able to use these windfalls and channel them into the coffers of the state, you need some state capacity, right? I mean, that was kind of when we, sometimes when we had the Greek debt crisis some years back, the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems was that this Greek state would struggle to kind of levy enough taxes, right? Where basically there are a lot of positive assets in the Greek economy, but the Greek state would just have troubles to tax enough to keep the budget running, and then they came up with, well, okay, if people find ways to evade taxes, let's maybe do a tax on swimming pools or something, right? So here it's a question of fiscal capacity, because if you have enough fiscal capacity, you're able to have a really big tax base, nobody can evade, and you get away with taxing very little, with a low average tax rate. While if you have low fiscal capacity, well, you have a small tax base because few people cannot evade taxes, and then you have to tax them like crazy with a very high rate, and then the few people you tax, they also will try to find ways to not be taxed, and it's a vicious cycle. And so what we would expect is that if you have a high fiscal capacity, you can much better benefit from commodity price shocks. And that's what we do. So we distinguish between these two things. And what we see is that with high fiscal capacity, the coefficient is bigger than the baseline coefficient, and with low fiscal capacity, it's nothing. So with low fiscal capacity, even if you have the greatest commodity price positive shock, it doesn't do anything to you because all the money goes elsewhere. The state cannot get at it. So that's in line with this story. Now, let's see how windfalls affect military spending as well. And so there, what we can, now we're going to go to the country level, country years as a level of observation, and so we have, because then we can look at military spending as well. And so the regression we run is that X, the dependent variable, is basically military expenditures, government revenues, or external debt, and we look at how these things evolve depending on a given shock that there is in the windfalls, and we control for country fixed effects, for time fixed effects, And we can now distinguish even for positive windfalls and negative windfalls. And so when we do that, so here I skip this, and then I skip this because I want to show it graphically. It's easier and nicer. And then I can also distinguish between times of conflict and peace. So if I do all these different distinctions, I end up with a lot of different graphs. But let me talk through. So positive windfalls are blue, negative windfalls are pink. And here we have always the expenditures, military expenditures, government revenues, and external debt, and in times of conflict, and here in times of peace. The pattern is the same, simply the coefficients are bigger in terms of conflict than in peace, as you see, so the scale is not the same. And so what do we find? Well, what we find is that, if we start here, is that if there are positive windfalls in times of conflict, then basically more than 50% of the money goes into the coffers of the state. On average, it was 33%, right before. You remember, it was a third. But if it's in conflict, it's more than 50%. That's what you see in Russia. The oil price, I mean, you know, that gets all in the army, or in Myanmar, everything goes into the army. So while in terms of peace, well, if you have this extra shock from commodity price boom, then a bit more than 10% would go into government revenues. And then for negative shocks, it's just the inverse. Now, which then, well, that's general government revenues, but then which part goes straight into the army in general? And that's here, military expenditures. And so it's like a fifth of the 50%, so 10% goes straight into the army. So that's then a really big effect, right? Where basically you have a windfall shock, and 10% of the money from a windfall shock goes directly into the army in times of war, which in general we have a GDP, defense spending is maybe 1 or 2% of GDP. So I don't know how big it is in Argentina. It's probably not that big, right? Not under very big threat. So in principle, you want to spend money for something else, right? So yeah, so in Switzerland as well, it's like, so far it has been 1%, right? But then if you have a shock in terms of when you're in conflict, then it's 10% of this extra money that goes straight in the army, which is 10 times more than status quo in Switzerland. And for a negative shock, it's the inverse. And in peace, it's the same, but it's just smaller numbers. And then what you see as well is that here in conflict, if you have a negative shock, you also have a tendency to increase debt. It's not statistically significant estimate, a big confidence intervals, but the idea would be that if you have a negative shock, well, you're desperate, you're in war, you just kind of increase your debt. That's what Ukraine is doing, right? Yeah. Okay, and so that's what you can see here.
Sorry, external debt. What sort of component does include external debt? Just debt with the market, with, I don't know, international organization like IMF, what kind of items are included?
So it's just off-the-shelf external debt over GDP, macro variable from IMF, I guess, or.
But it's total, all lenders included.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I think this is what my colleague asked.
Yeah. And so then there's something else that's also kind of so now that's a bit that's maybe data that I've never seen before that project, and maybe it's also new for you. So then what we can do is we can look at, well, I mean, one big debate. You see that the paper is a bit motivated by the situation in Switzerland and Germany, right? We're in the heart of Europe. Russia is pretty close. You could drive to, you could drive to Russia by car in a small number of days, right? It is very, very close. And so we're kind of course, in Europe rather worried about the war in Ukraine and also about future behavior of the Putin administration. And so one of the things that we have in these policy debates is kind of the question of, well, now if Germany decides to rearm, the problem is, of course, that they're not really good at this, so they have no clue. They have not been, thankfully, they have not been in a war for a long time, and then the country is super bureaucratic, and so it takes also time to rearm. So some of the things, for example, Switzerland ordered some planes from the US a long time ago that have never been delivered, and now they cost more. Or the Patriot missiles, defense missiles that Switzerland ordered from the US, now they're not available anymore because they've used them in Iran, where they shoot like crazy missiles every minute. And so in that sense, these kind of things, it takes a long time to build up military capacity. And so in that sense, what we study now, part of this mechanism section is also, well, how does these windfall shocks have an impact on medium-run build-up of military capacity? And so, to do that, there is this data on the number of distinct military technologies at disposal of a country I. So I'll show you on the next slide what they are, but they're like, I think 23 or whatever it is, a number of different military capabilities, and the variable that we created just goes from 0 to the maximum number. And the maximum number, I think there are only 3 countries in the world having all the military, 3 or 4, having all the military capacities, US, Russia and China or something. So we look at, well, if now you have this positive windfall shock, does it increase your likelihood to add in a few years' time another military capacity to your arsenal in some sense? And so I mean that's the most kind of defense economics paper I have. It's not that the rest of my research is more like peace economics and political economics and study democracy. It's not like that I'm a war hawk and I spend my time reading about this battle of World War and I get all worked up. So it's an outlier in some sense, right? But yeah, so that's why this data was new for me as well. And so you have here all these capacities, and so each one gives you 1 point, right? And so if you're kind of the weakest military regime somewhere, well, they would only have like really basic rifles, and that's all they have. And then maybe they have some really early generation tank. And then the US would have everything, right? They would have all the different rifles, all the aircraft, all the combat helicopters, the tanks of the newest generation and everything. And so we just take the sum of these capacities, military capacities, and we look at whether the sum goes up if you have this windfall shock. That's all we do with local projections. And the result? Oh. How can that be? Yeah, well, it's not such a maybe I should try the PowerPoints again. I should switch to files again, maybe not.
If you go to the next one, it's...
Or maybe it just takes time. But yeah, so let's wait. So basically what you're going to see is basically, yeah, that over time, you see this effect that these capacities are building up.
Shall we take a back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind. No, it's good.
Okay.
That's it, yeah. That's the results, right? So thanks a lot. So it's the year after the shock, and it takes some time. Indeed, that's exactly what the NATO people are saying. Well, Europe would be ready to defend against Putin in 1932 or something, but Putin may be ready to attack Europe already in 1930. there's unfortunately some gap of 2 years or something, right? But yeah, so it's something like that, right? It would take a few years to get enough capacity ready to defend Europe if we can't count on the US anymore. And so that's kind of what you see here, that with windfall shocks, so how 1 percentage point windfall relative to GDP shock would increase by over a few years' time, would kind of lead to this increase in military capacities some years down the road. And that's the case both in times of peace and in times of conflict. In times of conflict, it's just really big confidence intervals, because thankfully we have fewer conflicts in our data set than times of peace here for this exercise. Yeah, and so that's pretty much, so to conclude, well, money wins wars, so we find this effect that these exogenous shocks in money play a role, these windfalls. And so what are the policy implications? So I wrote this book about the consequences of the war in Ukraine, together with Garicano and Guede Di Mauro. We wrote this e-book, and there we talk a lot about oil and gas, because of course, I mean, Russia's economy it's to a dominant share of its economy is just about oil and gas. I mean, some people call it a petrol station, right? So I mean, this country is all about oil and gas, and the higher the prices are, and the easier they can export at high prices, the more cash they have to hire all these people from peripheral regions of Russia, but also even from abroad. So they recruit in other countries as well. So it's much easier for them to win in Ukraine or attack other countries. So it's all about this fossil fuel cash. And sanctions, of course, play a big role, but then sanctions can be evaded. They're tricky as well. You don't want to hit the civilian population as well. And so these results, that they kind of fit into this global debate, which at least in Europe is like a really big debate on what we should do in terms of defense. I don't know if in Latin America it's a big debate. Yeah, you don't debate on these things, right? So
we don't spend money really on that. I think in security and not really now. Part of the budget. Maybe macroeconomics knows the numbers, but.
Okay, so yeah, well, thanks for your attention.
Thank you.